Since then, we've seen no significant increase in power prices, and the U.S. now has the cheapest electricity in the world without even using subsidies. You can look at specific states to get an idea of how it's different around the country. This is Newark, where it is illegal to produce natural gas in any appreciable volume, but they have no problem importing it from next door in Pennsylvania. Then here's Texas, where, of course, it's wildly legal to produce the stuff, and they have seen power prices drop by about 30% in the last decade, among the lowest in the country. Now, here's California. California is the only state in the lower 48 that is not participating in the shale revolution in some way. They're not using the technologies to produce locally, and the pipelines that bring natural gas in from the rest of the country have been at max capacity for quite some time. So California now has the highest electricity prices in the lower 48. They're going up, and they're probably going to be going up for at least the next 25 to 30 years. After that, we'll have to see what happens with technology, but it does put California at a competitive disadvantage versus the rest of the country. And then there's the issue of transport. Now, back during the 1980s, the Iranians and the Iraqis were involved in a bitter war. And by the time we got to 1985, that war on land had reached a stalemate. So they started throwing missiles at each other's commercial shipping in this tanker war. 300 vessels were hit, 50 were disabled, and about a dozen were sunk. That almost destroyed the global insurance industry because no one had ever made allowances for damage to commercial shipping, which is normally a low-risk venture on that scale, and it changed the way we insure vessels today. If you want to insure your vessel, you have to pay an annual premium of about 2.5% of the value of your vessel. This assumes you never navigate into a zone of conflict. You should use sail into a conflict zone. The price of that insurance increases by a factor of 100 to be paid out every week. That assumes no one shoots at any commercial shipping. Should someone be taking potshots at commercial vessels, your policy evaporates. It's null and void. So the first time in this post-America world where shipping is targeted, you can guarantee that no one is going to be sailing anywhere near these conflict zones. That's 3/4 of manufacturing supply chain steps, 3/4 of global agricultural shipments, and 3/4 of global energy supplies gone. Now, for most Americans, this is a minor issue. Most of our trade is within the Western Hemisphere. In fact, half of our trade is just with Canada and Mexico. Doesn't have to sail in the deep blue sea. But that's not the case for California. It isn't just the state most dependent upon trade with East Asia. It's the trade gateway, has lots of throughput, all of which sails the deep blue sea manufacturing. You can get an idea of where some of these exposures specifically lie when you look at manufacturing chains. The 1555 in the middle of this graphic is the total value-added manufacturing within the United States, and all the circles and arrows on the outside pointing in are where all the components come from. The 1555 in the middle of this graphic indicates the total of value-added manufacturing in the United States. That's $1. 55 trillion. All of the circles and arrows that flow in from the outside indicate the value in billions, and then the color indicates the likelihood it's going to be disrupted in this world that we're moving into. Green means it's probably fine. Yellow means figure 25% of it's not going to make it. Orange is half, and red means just don't count on it at all. It's not going to show up. Now, you'll notice for the United States that there's a lot of green, a fair amount of yellow, and no red. That doesn't mean that the United States is immune to what's coming, but it's something we can grow through. It's something we can manage. By the way, the state that's most exposed to all of this in absolute terms is Texas, but most of that exposure is via Mexico. So that's probably fine. It's not fine for the Germans. The Germans are much more dependent on the countries that they border, and especially on countries beyond the horizon for their value add. In addition, because they have the world's second most rapidly aging demography, They are wildly dependent on countries beyond the horizon to purchase the end product. The German system relies heavily on American security oversight. However, this pales in comparison to the challenges faced by the Chinese. The Chinese are completely dependent on high tech from other sources. Now, I'm sure that you have heard of the main China 2025 program, the idea that China is seeking technological parity with the United States in just 5 years. If you talk to any Chinese bureaucrat behind closed doors where their minder is not listening, it'll become pretty obvious to you that 2025 is really just the first step. They don't expect true parity until at least 2070. Decision making, they don't have that kind of time. Now, some version of this holds true, obviously, especially in manufacturing. The U.S. is very well positioned for the low end. The shade revolution and low transport costs to end consumers bode very well for American low-end manufacturers. And the U.S. is also well positioned on the high end. The U.S. has the capital, the tech, and the labor force. And within manufacturing, there are two subsectors that are very heavily exposed to this. The first is automotive, but about 2/3 of that is within NAFTA. That's manageable. The bigger concern is the second one, technology manufacturing. About 2/3 of that is in East Asia, and we'll come back to that in just a minute. First, we have to have an idea of the decision-making process here. If this were just about energy and markets and transport and resources and finance, everybody would be handing to the United States. But it's not. It's also about coronavirus. No one knows precisely how long the pandemic will last or in what order will end, and this graphic gives you an idea of why. You can see the United States, the blue line, has never really recovered from our first wave, and we're already starting to gear up for something worse. The European Union did recover from their first wave, but they're already back to their first wave highs and are actually seeing a number of states like Spain that are already suffering in new infection rates that are worse than what we have here in the United States. The Middle East and the Latin American countries are, on the whole, as bad or worse than what's going on here in the United States. So you've got to decide what matters. If you were already looking to escape from China in 2019, whether it's because of human rights or information security or the police state or what's going on in Hong Kong or the genocide, coronavirus only confirms your decision and you accelerate your own extraction. But if you were hanging on due to sunk cost, you're probably going to wait to be forced by circumstances or governments. And for the most part, that's the view of Silicon Valley. They have bet their entire existence on globalization. Nearly their entire manufacturing chain is in East Asia, and very little of that is going to last, which means that when they do move, when they are forced to move, it will all move at once. Potential recipient locations who are ready for that can inherit 50 years of supply chain expansion almost overnight, and potential recipient locations who cannot will get nothing. Why am I specifically mentioning Silicon Valley and computing manufacturing? Personally, I think semiconductor manufacturing would be a great fit for Santa Clarita. Now we've talked about energy and transport and financial readiness. Let's look at some of the peculiarities of your geography and give you an idea of what that means for your possibilities. Let's start with the population density map. Population density. As you can see, California's population centers are not simply isolated from Canada and Mexico. They're separated from the UL. It's writ large and even from other major West Coast population centers. You zoom in a little bit and you can see that the Los Angeles basin isn't simply separated from the West Coast. It's broken off from the rest of California itself. Zoom in a little bit more. The various lobes of the LA basin are largely on their own, and even within the various lobes, there really isn't much of a transport network. It's pretty wretched. The population footprint is too dense to function without mass transit. And as you all know, there's really no mass transit within Los Angeles. I'm confident that you've spent more time stuck in Los Angeles traffic than you would have preferred.